For those of you who may have had your lunch out in front or someplace else, we've put the cookies and the fruit out now, and some of you have gotten it, but there are lemon bars, and there are chocolate fudge. You took that.
I'm sorry.
But there's some good fruit out there as well, so feel free to help yourself.
How can I compete against that?
Well, you're one of the few people who can. Well, we're really delighted. This is sort of the highlight of our conference, is to be able to have our talk this afternoon by Manuel. He's been working extensively on a new book, which he has almost done. And done with a few things remaining to be able to play.
Never let go, is it?
But given the conference title that we've had, you can see why we would be very interested in being able to have this as a feature of what our conference is. So, Manuel, I'm really looking forward to your talk and to discussing your new idea.
Thank you, my friend. So I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to talk about my new book. Janet, Nosh, and Peter asked me to do it, thinking that that was the proper venue and moment to share for the first time ever my book. Except for the first time because I finished exactly 1 week ago. It's currently already in the production process and will be published in September by Polity Press at Cambridge. Let me give you a little bit. So the title of the book says everything, and then, but I will comment additionally. The title of the book is Networks of Outrage and Hope: Social Movements in the Internet Age. The little background. I have been in the last 2 years, as many of you, following closely what was happening in terms of the worldwide spread of social movements, that most of which started in the internet, but of course connected immediately to the urban space and to social networks, face-to-face social networks, organizations, etc. Part of it, of course, is because of my personal and political interest for many years, and part of it was because I had explored years ago the formation of new kind of social movements in the book that I published in 2009, Communication Power, in which the key element of the book was to relate the social movements to and the formation of social movements to the ability to create communication networks and forms of communication that would bypass the control of what Karin called the gatekeepers, because the basic idea of the book, and of course of this book too, is that power and the fights in society about the formation of power relationships take place fundamentally in the human mind. If people think in ways that are contradictory to the institutionalized interests and values enforced by the different mechanisms of the state, if a large majority of people think otherwise, sheer violence under no circumstances will be able to prevail over the long term. Of course, it can be tears and blood and suffering, but ultimately there is no human organization that has been able to rely exclusively on sheer violence. And this is coming from someone who grew up in a fascist dictatorship and therefore that seemed to be invincible, as the Mubarak dictatorship was invincible. So I was working on all this. In fact, the theory underlying this book, it's the theory presented in Communication Power, which is on the one hand communication theory of power, but at the same time also somewhat related to the theory of affective intelligence of the political communication school, in which the analysis of emotions and the transformation of emotions and feelings for me is extremely important. But I was not planning to write a book. Usually I take 5 to 10 years to write books. And usually they are between 400 and 700 pages, so it takes a long time for me. But I gave a series of lectures throughout the year. I gave one lecture at Northwestern University, invited by NOSA, in fact, in another Sonic meeting that people were quite interested. And then in November, I gave a series of lectures at the University of Cambridge with a very good group of students and scholars, and was a symposium about what I was saying. And after that, my friend John Thompson, who in addition to be one of the most distinguished sociologists in the world, he owns, together with Anthony Giddens, Polity Press, said, well, this is the moment you have to write a book right now about these movements. Everybody is trying to discuss it. You already have lots of information and ideas, so you have to write it quickly, at least in 4 months. So I resisted until it made me feel guilty. Yeah, you academic, you don't care what goes going on in the world. By the time you publish your book with thousands of references and tables, all these movements will have been destroyed by repression, and they will not even know why. You academics are always the same. What about you? You say, well, I published what the other academics do. So fortunately, finally I surrendered, and I asked, but I needed, of course, the help of my great co-researchers, both in Barcelona and here, and Lana Sparks, who is there, said, don't worry, we'll do it in 4 months. Thanks to her and to... Oh, you said don't worry.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I was telling you about doing it in 4 months. And now she didn't come yesterday because she was sick, imagine why. And then my team in Barcelona and other people, and then my network of good friends and students and colleagues around the world. So ultimately, we did it. You will judge later. But I like to very quickly describe, but again in relationship to the context. And what I'm going to do here is fundamentally to present the headlines of what these movements are. I'm not going to go into they could have been with or without the internet, social media, or social media. I'm going to tell you what they are. And then we can discuss on this basis. In that sense, it was basically empiricist, trying to say, this is the animal we are talking about. And when I say the animal is something precise, I mean there are not many animals. It's one animal in different contexts and different formation, but have very similar characteristics. And these similar characteristics is what I'm going to try to convey. And of course with cultural varieties, etc. But one thing that we know is that in the mid-2010 until now, say for the last 2 years, has been an explosion of very similar social movements of this kind. They are spreadable. They have diffused virally, and they have many different forms. I studied in depth some of them, and particularly I was active in the Barcelona movement, but Lana and other people were active in the Occupy US, and of course I have been following through her. But there are many other movements. Some of them not very influential or active, like Occupy Amsterdam. I talked there, and basically it was a marginal movement. Occupy London was so-so. When they would go with the trade union, they would become important. When they would go by themselves, less important. But, you know, if you want some indication, in the United States, we have mapped out, in the book, about 1,000 sites of the Occupy movement. 1,000 sites. In Spain, 120. And at one point, when the Spanish movement started in May 2011, 1 week later, we mapped out Occupy movements around the world, and there were 850 occupations in the world in 1 week. Well, but started earlier. Started where? Started in Finland, in Iceland. Started in Iceland. Started in Iceland in 2009. And then in Tunisia. So that's why the first chapter of my book is comparing Iceland and Tunisia. And with very empirical details on both. And finding the same structure, the same organization, the same slogans, the same ability to connect through the internet and the urban space. Well, if Iceland and Tunisia look similar, to some extent means that something new from that point of view, which takes place in different contexts, should be investigated. So the book starts like this and then goes into a detailed analysis of the Egyptian revolution. Then it's a quick chapter of all the other Arab revolutions, with one major and sinister theme: how you kill a social movement by transforming it into a civil war. And sometimes social movements don't have any other choice. And then I go into an in-depth analysis of the Spanish movement, I knew very well, and then another in-depth analysis of the Occupy movement. And through that, I end up with a synthesis, empirical synthesis of the movement and some reflection, because I was strongly asked and recommended not to go beyond 50,000 words, which is what I did. So it's a short book. It's a book that, and it's a book that is somewhat academic in the sense of the research, but it's written in a language that some people could understand. So let me then try to go into the main features that are common to all the movements with some variations, which therefore for me looks like an emerging pattern. And then I will simply add a few reflections on the matter. First of all, these movements are all network. I would totally agree with the notion that all social movements in history have been networked. But the interesting thing about this one, these are also networked in multiple forms. They are, of course, networked in the internet. They are in the wireless communication network. They are networked in the urban space. They are networked in terms of social network. But the fundamental logic, organization, and practice of the movement is network. Furthermore, networks are within the movement and with other movements around the world. And in that sense, the networking technologies are a constitutive part of the movements everywhere, everywhere. And the fundamental role of these networking technologies is to allow the formation of the movement beyond the control of the authorities of the state, and breaking through the monopoly of communication information from the mainstream media. That's the fundamental thing. And therefore, organizing an autonomous network or sets of networks which also provide their own way of accessing people's minds. That's the key. The key is how people can connect to each other without being mediated by media which are controlled. That's the fundamental point. Moreover, these movements, they have multiple nodes, and that's what allows that there is no formal leadership everywhere. In some cases, there are faces of the movement, as in the case of Israel, but otherwise there are faces, but no command and control center. Any attempt to create a command and control center is immediately rejected by the movement society, everywhere, including in Egypt, including in the Arab revolutions. Now, they have no center, and they have the ability to have a distributed capacity of information and decision making. Now, this decentered structure maximizes the chances of participation. Anyone can join, like in a network. Anyone can add the node, can add the network. Anyone. And every time that something happens to the network reconfigures itself. So it's a self-reconfiguration capacity. Furthermore, networking in the movement protects the movement against repression. It's always possible to escape this. You cannot find the nodes of the you cannot destroy every node because nodes regenerate themselves, but also protect the movement against itself. Most social movements destroy themselves from internal fighting, from becoming factionalism, from starting to fight each other. That is, people can attack each other on the network, but the network survives. So network movements, but multiple modality of this network. That's the important thing. And I find particularly irrelevant the discussion, what comes first? Is most important the internet or wireless, or is the connection to the mass media or blogs or people in the street? What is all of that? All of that network between these different networks at different levels of multimodality. Second, they become a movement. They are born almost systematically in the internet, in terms of discussion, in terms of calls to action, in terms of debates, but they become a movement by becoming visible in the urban space. So it's the passage from cyberspace to urban space that constitutes the movement. Why they need to go into urban space? First, for visibility. And that could be occupation or can be a street demonstration. In Israel, for instance, were much more important street demonstrations than occupation. But when they are in the urban space, when they occupy the urban space, this has a key function, is to have people together. They are not a community. Why? Because they don't share a program, they don't share specific values, and communities are based on values. Everybody can join the movement by being in that urban space. But it's not a community, but it's something different. It creates the material conditions for togetherness. So they are together. They feel each other. Now, this I go back to the roots of the analysis in terms of the theory of affective intelligence and the role of emotions. To understand the formation of social movements, materially speaking, we have to start with the individuals, with the persons. Not with class, not with communities, not with religion. People are people first. And then they aggregate themselves. It's good that we have aggregated categories in terms of social class, in terms of gender, but I have never seen a social class walking in the street. I have not been personally introduced to any gender. I know men and women, I know workers, I know exploited people, So the key thing is how in the mind of the individual they shift from accepting through resignation or through adherence to whatever is established, or how they react. Well, we know that the most paralyzing emotion is fear. Fear. And you know why? The evolutionary theory tells that we are all the survivors of cowards, because those who were courageous didn't run fast enough and were killed by their enemies. So any courageous ancestor is dead. It's a self-selection of the species. Only the cowards survive. Therefore, fear is the most important emotion, and it's a paralyzing emotion. But at the same time, fear can be overcome. By what? By the combination of two emotions. Outrage, when you cannot take it anymore, you overcome fear. But only on the condition of being together with others. And this togetherness starts in the networks. Yes, I agree with you. Yes, I do it with you. And then becomes materialized in the urban space. Once people are able to overcome fear and get engaged in the action toward, because of their outrage, then they generate the most potent positive emotion, hope. And hope is what then drives the movement. One little illustration of this from a tweet from the streets of Hama in a woman, Rabia Al-Husseini, that tweeted to a friend of mine, copied the tweet that she was spreading around. We have brought down the wall of fear. Fear. You brought down the wall of our house. We'll rebuild our homes, but you will never build that wall of fear. So you see, movements have a high level of self-consciousness, much more than sometimes we allow them to. So the connection between the urban, cyberspace, what I call the space of flows, and the urban space, what I call the space of places. This connection is constant and is networked. And that's what I call a third form of a space, which is the space of autonomy. The space of autonomy is what connects the freedom of connecting in the internet with the expression in the urban space, forming sets of people that are together and are visible in society. Now this is, by the way, is important to understand that occupations don't happen on wherever space. Occupations always are in symbolic spaces and in symbolic buildings that have meaning. And the critical issue will be, as evictions of urban occupations multiply, which kind of forms of togetherness the movement will be finding in the future. Third, movements are local and global at the same time. They start in a specific context for their own reasons, and I think this morning's presentation was really emphasizing that. Movements are local, they're not, but they immediately connect to global. And is that global local network, which by the way can only be realized through the internet and through wireless communication, that constant global local network, local ultimately, that characterizes of these movements. Now, in terms of their genesis, these movements are largely spontaneous in their origin. They are usually triggered by spark of indignation, outrage. So that's what triggers the movement. What we know in the Arab Revolution. Yes, we know that all these movements respond to conditions of unbearable oppression, injustice, humiliation. Humiliation is very important. Most of these movements start with a claim for dignity. Dignity is much more important than fighting exploitation. Started in Tunisia, started in Egypt. The notion that I cannot be humiliated, I cannot take it anymore. And the same thing in the democratic movements, in the democratic countries, and all the movements were democratic, but in the movements in democratic countries, the notion that I cannot take it any longer became essential. Sometimes a particular event, in other cases, a broader set of events linked to a particular condition. In Europe, the financial crisis was extremely important. The view of governments taking state measures, cutting every social service, while at the same time the banks being bailed out and making historic profits and being the ones who were bankrolling the politicians and all the parties together in this particular connection to the financial elites, that connection is what made the people explode. And that was very similar to the United States. In the case of the United States, for instance, there are a number of studies, including the best data are what Sasha was collecting, and he gave me an unprocessed version of the data, which cannot publish in the book because he has to publish. But through his data and others that I have been able to collect, a good number of people who started Occupy were refugees from the Obama campaign who tried to play into the system, tried to play through reform, etc., as we have seen and Lance was saying the other day. And then they found that not that Obama necessarily was a traitor, but he had been captured by the financial elite anyway, and that the cabinet of the White House was dominated again by Wall Street. So when people say, Occupy Wall Street is revolting against the financial system, no, it's revolting against Wall Street, which is a different thing because it's also the dominant force within all presidential cabinets in the White House. It's that connection, and that was the same in every European country. So the spark is essential. Without the spark, nothing happens. Again, I insist, Arab dictatorship for many, many years, crisis in Europe for many, many years, is at one point there is a spark. Without this spark, how the spark is generated? I don't know. We don't know in physics how the Big Bang was generated, right? But we know there was a Big Bang. And what Macy was telling us this morning, how do you reach the critical mass? We don't know how the critical mass is reached, but we know what happened then. So that is critical for us as social scientists to understand and to differentiate how the spark is generated, but at the same time, the necessary but not sufficient condition of the spark to trigger a movement. Then, movements are viral, and they follow the logic of the internet networks. And this is not about the diffusion of the messages themselves, although this diffusion is important, and particularly images are extremely important. These movements need images, they need to see, and that's where the whole media ecology is important, because images mobilize, and why they mobilize? They touch emotions. Seeing people like you being beaten, or killed, or tortured, or simply pepper gas sprayed, in democratic countries, it's simply pepper spray. It's not like bullets, but it will come. Bullets will come. So images are very important, but there's something else. They spread, and very fast, from one country to another, and from one city to another, moved by another emotion, hope. If it had happened there, why not here? These people are able to do it. For me, it was very revealing in the first demonstration in Cairo, the one before the 25th. The slogan of the demonstration was, "Tunisia is the solution." Now, the grammar is important here because traditionally all these last year demonstrations in Egypt and other Arab countries were organized around the slogan, "Islam is the solution." So very much on purpose, they changed and said, no, Tunisia is the solution. We did not refer to Islam, referred to everything, to everybody, meaning we cannot get through without the toppling this dictatorship. It was about democracy not as a project, but democracy as a way to get rid of the humiliation from the authorities. In Spain, the movement started, the very first demonstration before May, with the slogan, "Iceland is the solution." You think about that. It's explicit consciousness of, I want to connect to these guys who are doing this. What Iceland was doing, well, for me, the most extraordinary experience. Iceland nationalized the banks, put in jail the bankers, put under the justice procedure the prime minister, who has been sentenced finally only to 7 months for mismanagement of the crisis. What about that? And redid the entire constitution based on citizen participation, and they crowdsourced the constitution. There's a new constitution to be approved next month in Iceland that was consulted and debated over the internet by a committee appointed among ordinary citizens, not politicians. Okay, Iceland is Iceland. But in terms of the imaginary for the other people in the world, say, well, we want like Iceland. Well, we will not be able to get it, but you know, we're not dreaming. There's a little country like Iceland which is doing this thing, and it started with a movement. It started by blowing up completely the political system that existed, etc., etc. The same thing between Tunisia and Egypt and all the other Arab revolutions. Then what happens afterwards really depends on context, depends on countries, depends on cultures, depends on all kinds of the specificity of the process. For instance, why Syria is not like Egypt? Well, 3 reasons: China, Russia, and Iran, which block completely the possibility of any support from other countries or other networks. But they are still there, they are still fighting. They have been, 10,000 people have been killed over 1 year, and they are still fighting. And there was no forces behind it, no political leadership, spontaneous uprisings, etc., etc. We can discuss on the specifics of the countries if you want. Now, the virality of the movement is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. The transition from outrage to hope, then, is accomplished by deliberation, in the Habermasian sense, in the space of autonomy. And the space of autonomy is this interaction between the occupied space and the network space, in that combination. And please, if we continue to work on this, let's just forget about the discussion if they were tweeted, not tweeted. Of course they were tweeted, but they were also occupied, and they were also demonstrating, and they were also talking to each other, and they were using fax machines, they were using everything, everything, as normal in any movement history. So why these movements are more on the internet than before? Because there was no internet before. so the movements exist. The movements exist with the communication media and communication networking capacity of their society, in the working class movement in the 19th century, they started in the large factories. Why? Because there they could see that they were a class. They could touch the class. The guy on the assembly line on my side, that guy is like me. Started in the pubs. Why? Because in the pubs was the space of autonomy vis-a-vis the factory. And each society and each social movement started with the tools of their trade. So, in our society, particularly for people under 35, which is 70% of the population of the Arab countries, they live in the internet. Even when they don't have internet, they find ways to be in the internet. Their point of reference is the virtual networks, but not only. There are other points of reference in Egypt concretely were the soccer fans clubs. That was extremely important in the Egyptian revolution. But again, the combination. And that combination is the space of autonomy, and that's where the liberation appeared. Then, what I mentioned before. Togetherness requires physical contact. It's not a community because they do not have common values. This is important. They have common criticism, but not common values. Everybody comes with his, her own values. That's why the movement is so important and so popular. Because you don't have to adhere to any program, to any ideology, to any religion. Everybody comes with his, her own life experience, and there is no hegemonic ideology. Anyone trying to impose something is not heard, simply not heard. It's not expelled from the movement, it's simply not heard, not paid attention to. So people fight each other. In the occupied movement in the United States, they have people of color, and women, and gays, and lesbians, and WASP. They have tried to block the movement because they did not represent enough their own values. But so what? The movement was all this. So there were fights, but then the only thing that happened then is some people create their own movement on the side. But since this is not an organization, there is still people being around. The networks are based on two things: the togetherness in the Spanish movement. Their slogan, the key slogan was "Together we can." In feminine, by the way. So the Spanish movement talks in feminine, everything. Juntas podemos. Together we can. And the other thing is that the horizontality of the networks supports coordination and supports solidarity, while limiting the necessity for formal leadership. We'll come in a second to the problem that this creates. Another common characteristic everywhere: there are highly self-reflective movements. They debate all the time. They talk all the time about who they are, what we really want. Remember, all this starts as a spontaneous spark of indignation, and then what? We don't know. And the main attitude is, let's talk about it. We have time. That's fundamental. The slowness of the movement. The slowness of the movement. The most popular slogan in the Spanish movement was, "We are slow because we go far." And we are going to discover ourselves in the process. Why? Because many people this is the first time they participate in any major protest, but others, they had the experience of all these endless causes manipulated by revolutionary groups, by all left that tried to be new by being hobnobbing with the young people, so to see if they could go back to their childhood. No, all of this is verboten. No, we don't have to go back there. We are already there. And we create what? A party that's going to have 3% of the vote, and then merge with another one that will get 3% more, and then will be 6% in the parliament, and then what? Another important feature which is systematic, and for me is the defining moment of truth for the movement in the months to come. They are explicitly non-violent movements, engaging the practice of civil disobedience. Now, as in any social movement of a certain size, movement that mobilizes hundreds of thousands of people, there are always some people who decide that that's a great moment to start their own revolution by attacking police, breaking a few windows. But it's very, very limited. It's very, very limited. What happened, the Black Bloc in Italy in the globalization, that was more serious matter. That was a serious matter. And now the Black Bloc is trying to reappear. But until now, at least, we don't know in the future. Until now, what I have observed is the movement has tried to avoid violence, and more important, overwhelmingly they are non-violent. Now, I have myself participated in a big discussion on the matter. One of my talks that is now viral in the internet, in which I said that the most important, the fight in May 27th, very important that it's much more courageous not to be violent in front of violence, because otherwise it's delegitimation of the movement. 6 hours later, the police attacked the encampment, and was a real beating, like in the Gandhi movie, with people being bloodied for 6 hours, and a new line of people would come and sit peacefully and being bloodied, and another line until 157 people were sent to the hospital. Of course, what happens after that was that the movement received overwhelming support of the population, and there were tens of thousands of people demonstrating against that, which is also part of the history of social movement, has always been done. If the repression does not eliminate the movement, when the barrier of fear is already overcome, the movement is in fact strengthened. Yeah, there are martyrs, but all revolutions have martyrs. Now, the problem is, of course, if you don't have institutional response, like in Israel, so such a nice Israeli government, Netanyahu, great hero of peace and everything, and they are nice to the demonstrators. But if you don't have such a great government, and if all governments block, and if all governments stop the movement and use simply police and not reform, then people start getting nervous. What should we do? Well, at least they do something which has been traditionally done by the movement, civil disobedience. And they block peacefully some buildings, they sit in the streets, they protest in front of some meetings. When that also is forbidden, then becomes certain and there you have some reactions that could lead to violence. As soon as the movement becomes violent, in the case of the non-democratic country dictatorships, Arab countries, etc., that becomes civil war. And goodbye to the movement. That then is a civil war of different kind. And on the civil wars, geopolitical factors intervene. Intervene in Libya, intervene in Syria, intervene in Bahrain. Bahrain was one of the worst massacres in the Arab revolts have been in Bahrain, conducted by Pakistani mercenaries and Saudi Arabian troops with the indifference of the United States, because Bahrain is the main military base in the Arabian Peninsula. And then, yes, well, the movement in Bahrain as a movement has disappeared. So it's possible when you go to the extreme of violence. In Libya, there is no movement. It's now tribal, factionalist, etc. In Syria, there is still a movement, but on the edge of going to civil war. Why to civil war? Not because of the movement, but because Saudi Arabia and Jordan have sent their own trained militia to Syria to fight Assad, who is supported by Iran. And that's part of the geopolitical game between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But, so through different ways, the worst enemy of the social movements as they started, the one poison that could kill them, is the shift towards some form of violence that immediately amplified by the media is delegitimizes the movement. And the only thing that the movement has to connect to the 99% is legitimacy. The only thing. Which then is extremely important there, the role of non-controlled media, social media, television network that can diffuse the ideas and the real images of the movement, because that restores the connection between movement and population at large. So again, the communication process is absolutely essential. Another key feature, these movements are rarely programmatic movements, rarely, except when they focus on ending a dictatorship, and then they have one demand: the dictator should go, and all the clique around the dictator. But they are not programmatic movements. Now, many people say, well, that's a weakness, and it is, because you don't identify a number of issues, you don't have specific demands. How can you mobilize, and how can actually measure your impact on society and on the institutions? Well, on the other hand, if they have a specific program targeting a few number of issues and policies attached to the issues, then they will only attract those people who support these issues, who are interested in these issues and in these particular policies. An example, one of the main demands of the Spanish movement was the change of the electoral law, which really is based on the don't rule, and therefore all the two major parties get everything. I actually participated in the drafting of an alternative electoral law, very serious with all the technicalities. We did a mathematical distribution of the seats under the different forms, etc., etc. And that was supported by most of the movement. But the movement was not about the electoral law. It was about many other things. So ultimately what movement do, they put everything together. And they have a manifesto about 351 demands, all equally important, because you cannot drop anyone. So that's a weakness, because you don't have a concrete program that prioritizes and has to be implemented, etc. But at the same time, this is the strength, because the movement says, well, whatever people want. Why whatever people want? Because what they are asking for is for representation and participation. We will not elaborate because the problem is, yes, we have all these demands, but regardless of the policies that we propose, if there is no channel of true political representation and participation, there is no point about making more demand. It will go into the same process and will be rejected, because we already have that. If the political parties do their own thing for their own interests, regardless of what we propose, will go into the political parties. So we have to create a power relationship between whatever is the movement and the political party for they to pay attention. because until now they are not paying attention. Why not? Because why political parties that have designed an electoral law to keep the control of the parliament through only for the two parties, why they would change that if it's the two parties who have to change that? Well, only at the one condition, that they cannot resist any longer, that the crisis of legitimacy becomes threatening, and then they have to concede. But that's not at this stage of the movement. So they are social movements in the sense that they try to change the values of the society. But they also are very political in a fundamental sense. They are not partisan. That's the fundamental thing. They are not partisan anywhere. No one single movement of these movements is partisan. Then some parties can use them or not. For instance, in Italian municipal elections, in Milan and in Napoli and in Torino, there were very good connections initiated by the Partito de Sinistra, Partito Democratico de Sinistra, that at the same time connected with the movement. And they won the elections supported by the movement. And they are doing a number of interesting things. But the movement as such did not. It was the other movement, the other initiative. The initiative from the political system to say, we'll do this and this and this, support us. And then say, okay, let's try. And it worked. It worked. And this is very important. One of the things people are not realizing, and Mario for sure knows much better that, but I have a number of friends in Italy, that the Italian movement is a very interesting movement, has different forms. Occupy a little bit, not too much, but the demonstrations are very important. The mobilization of women against Berlusconi has been extremely important in the fall of Berlusconi, and the women mobilized on the slogan, the country does not deserve you, but men are not able to get rid of you, we will. And they did. Well, I would say that the financial markets and the European Commission help a little bit, but it's always a coincidence, a convergence of factors, Mario. But the Italian movement is a much deeper movement. There was a big truckers movement recently in Italy that blocked the country for a while in support to a number of demands. So they are extremely political, but in one sense, in changing the rules of democracy. And the one thing that I think we can say is common to all the movements is about changing the structure and logic of the state. So and in that sense, they are fundamentally political movements. So the difference between having a political program or a political party or being political. One simply headline for you to know where I'm going, but I have a last section in my book about why the internet is much more than a technology, because all technologies are culture, we know that, and internet materializes the culture of autonomy. Was designed on purpose, in some cases by people I know very well personally, they've been served, with the idea of autonomy, and creating an autonomous communication network that would escape as much as possible to all controls. And around the internet, it has been a number of developments that had made the freedom in the internet the basis for the culture of autonomy, and this has become a political goal in itself. This is extremely important throughout the world. And that key consequences of this. In the formation of these movements in several countries, networks of bloggers have been very important. In Tunisia, they were killed, several of them, until the whole network of bloggers started to mobilize. In Spain, some of the initial initiators of the movement were linked, network among themselves in the fight for the freedom of the internet, which is under constant attack in the European Union with a number of laws much worse than SOPA. In the case of, in all the countries, Anonymous has been a driving force, including the United States. This is also manifested in the fact that any time that there is a threat to the internet, you have a huge global network of hackers that come to the rescue and I have a detailed technical analysis in my book about how the blackout of Egyptian internet for 5 days didn't work. Communication went through a number of mechanisms. If you are interested, we can discuss it. So, what ultimately is resulting from these social movements, the famous notion of the outcomes of social movements? There has been, and there is, a huge debate within the movement, which I think is more interesting than many of the things we discuss in the research world, about what is an outcome. What is an outcome? And the debate is in the following terms. Is process or is product? And they use these words. And there is a critique of the underlying ideology, saying to look always for the outcome and measure the success of the movement in terms of the outcome is actually to internalize the productivist logic of capital. And some people are not only of capital, of any productivist system, the system that maximizes productivity as the goal. And people say, we don't care about productivity, we care about meaning of life. So the important thing for the movement is not to be productive, is to be able to generate what we would like to happen in our lives. And therefore, there is the predominant tendency in all the movement has been to say, we have to change the rules of the game, and we have to be able to find our own goals in the process, not to jump on some outcome that could be institutionally measured. Process rather than product. Okay. Now, but what is the process? That's the point. That's a very nice intellectual approach, as a matter of fact. Very sophisticated, but okay, then what is the process? The product we know is the institutional change at one point in societies, institutions that organize society for the other. There's some utopian version of the movement that simply say, well, we are going to self-manage the entire society and the entire world through the internet and local assemblies. Great guys. But they are convinced that this is possible. So if people are convinced of something by hundreds of thousands, some things, not exactly that, but some things can happen. But okay, let's say that we take a more pragmatic attitude, say, well, we are going to see institutional changes, and the others want process change. Which are process changes? Fundamentally two, and that's what we were working with Karim. Organizational change. The form of organization of the movement, and beyond the movement, the society. Beyond the movement, the 99%. Which kind of organization? Network organization, constantly forming and reforming and reorganizing itself, not relying on the traditional activists, the usual suspects, but constantly co-evolving with society. And that's why I have proposed this term, which in fact is in the movement, about the rhizomatic revolution. That is, networks of people doing things for certain purposes that appear and disappear depending on moment, depending on circumstances. There is something bad that happens in society, they converge, there is a spark, there is something, there is a mobilization. At one point, this may or not may translate into an impact on the institutional society, but it's always there, it's always beating. You know, it's always a heartbeat there, which we see, we don't see, it reorganizes itself. That is the rhizomatic form of organization, which is the concrete contribution of all the movements to the process. That's why the Islamists are going to win in Egypt. Well, yes, but they are not going to be, because in any free election in an Arab country in the last 10 years, the Islamists would win. So the issue is which kind of Islamists under which kind of control. In Spain, the movement, the great political success of the movement was the absolute majority of the Conservative Party in the election. What the success? Well, but if you look at the data, in fact, was not the Conservative Party that won, because with the same votes would have lost the last two elections, but the Socialist Party was destroyed, wiped out, 40% loss of the vote. So people would say, what a great progressive political impact to destroy the Spanish Socialist Party. There has been the reformist force in Spain for many years. But other people say, well, that will teach a lesson to the next one. These ones are not going to revive anymore. These are finished. But the other parties, whenever they appear, and if they appear, they will know that we don't necessarily have to go and vote. We can exercise veto power. Not only by ourselves not voting, but by creating such a crisis of legitimacy of the party in society at large, that then people are massively disaffected. Which is the point. It's not the power of the voting power of the movement. It's exposing the corruption and the political indifference of the existing parties of any kind to the movement. Results, 6 months after the election, after all this idea that, well, the movement doesn't count, etc. Yeah, the Socialist Party is still at the same level of vote, but the Conservative Party has dropped 15 points in the opinion polls. So the number one party with 65% of the vote is people who say they are all the same. That's a crisis of legitimacy. So I don't think it's a great development in history that the movements end up in simply crisis of legitimacy, but some people would say, is a precondition for something else. But the main thing is only through organizational change, that's how the argument goes, only through the transformation of the process, meaning organizational change and consciousness, there is or can be an institutional change under the conditions of the institution's inability or resistance to reform themselves. That's the point. If the institutions open up, that's it. It's the traditional connection, the social movement opens up the institutions. The institutions don't open up. It's only by the depth of transformation at the organizational and consciousness level that may happen some transformation of the institutions, ultimately in terms of policies. Now, how we know that there is a transformation of the consciousness level? Well, we don't. The direct answer is we don't, and people say it's too early. Don't rush. The slow time. There's a movement throughout the world that Lisa Sebon is studying very well. Is the slow movement, the slow cheetah, slow everything. Everything is slow. The transformation of time, instead of accelerating time, is slowing. We need time to live, to think, to enjoy. So this is also a slow movement, not in a rush. Let's see, will happen. But we do have a very imperfect tool, opinion polls. And opinion polls, the only systematic comparative database that with Lana we found, the Gallup poll, and on the one hand, and the Ipsos poll on the other hand, for 23 countries in the world, in terms of the attitude, recent attitudes toward the Occupy or similar movement throughout the world. There's only one country which the unfavorable are a little bit more than the favorable, to be expected. Which one?
U.S.
Huh?
The U.S.
No.
U.S.
No. Of course, Japan. But who cares about Japan? They don't care about the world, but we don't care about Japan. So, the U.S. and every other country of the poll, 22 countries, they are more favorable to the movement than unfavorable to the movement. Then the variation is in the middle, in those who are indifferent or don't know what to do. But at least there is 20 to 25% favorable everywhere. Now consider this is a movement doing illegal things, which is decried in the media. And why people support? Because of what they say and of the criticism. In the US, what happens, Lance, is that the people overwhelmingly support the movement. It used to be 70%, now it's about 56% or something. The problem is that they reject the forms of action. They reject the occupations per se. But even so, Lana, correct me, about 25 to 30% support their forms of action as well, the occupation in physical space, you know? Which again, when I saw this data, I was stunned. So at the very superficial level of public opinion support, the movement has more sympathy than not. And then country by country, then, like in Spain, etc., in Israel, then there is overwhelming support in terms of the goals of the movement and to a large extent of the occupation themselves. My prediction is that this will change as soon as violence starts. That's why governments want to start violence quickly. Because the trend is clearly, the more it goes, the more it is in support of the movement, because the crisis deepens, people don't have any other institutions. But so, in terms of the attitude of the public opinion, the most traditional social science data, these movements are not delegitimized, are more legitimate than political parties, and more legitimate than government, more than parliaments, more than politicians per se. So it's the data shows an absolute crisis of legitimacy everywhere, and relative support for the movement. But then, the one thing that obsesses me in terms of research, and I will be finishing with that, is that to find qualitative indicators that for the moment are only examples, illustrations of how the consciousness is affected and which are the many, many ways in which consciousness of people at large is being transformed, and how this goes into the heart of the system, the financial system, and the political system. So with your benevolence, I can give you one such example. There could be many others, but this is, I think, at least for me, stellar. And I read from an internet post, but this comes from the Mexican agency SPD, a serious one, and reported by Christian Wine from Alternet in the Post. And it reads like this, and this is on 23rd of March 2012. Yeah, right there. According to RT and SPD News, high-class escorts in Madrid, Spain, are protesting the banking sector by refusing to sell bankers their highly sought-after commodity, sex. The largest trade association for luxury escorts in the Spanish capital has gone on a general and indefinite strike on sexual services for bankers until they go back to providing credits to Spanish families, small and medium-sized enterprises and companies. It all started with one of the ladies who forced one of her clients to grant a line of credit and a loan simply by halting her sexual services until, quote, he fulfills his responsibility to society. The trade association spokeswoman praised their success by stressing how the government and the Bank of Spain have previously failed to adjust the credit flow. We are the only ones with a real ability to pressure the sector, she started. We have been on a strike for 3 days now, and we don't think they can withstand much more. The woman quoted above says bankers are desperate for sex services and have become so pitiful that they are unsuccessfully pretending to have other careers and have even asked the government for help. But the Minister of Economy, Luis de Guindos, reportedly told the Mexican SDP Noticias, which broke the story, that the escort industry lack of regulation makes government intervention difficult. In fact, there has not been a formal communication of the strike. The escorts are making use, according to the minister, of the right of admission or denying entry to, well, you know. So, no one can negotiate, making it clear that sex is a valuable tool, and refusing it sends a very strong direct message. Well, I'm not pretending that this will be the revolution. I'm using as an illustration that if there is a cultural transformation in many, many, many sectors of society, this filters down into non-traditional forms of political practice and rebellion. That's the argument, of course. But I could multiply many other examples that we are collecting with 19. And I would finish with one historical reminder. Empirically speaking, our democratic system has exhausted its legitimacy. This we know. This is a fact. The crisis has increased over the last 10 years. In addition, as long as things were more or less going right, people just do not care and concentrate on their lives. But the financial crisis has changed everything. So not only they cannot go on with their lives, but they have no instrument to alter the course of events. In the United States, the Obama campaign was the last attempt to change the rules. And there is massive disaffection for that. Most people polled who were supporters of Obama say they will vote, and yeah, they will close the nose and vote for Obama, but they don't expect much. They are voting against. The latest polls in France showed that 70% of the French people had voted against, and so on and so on. So under such conditions, the gap between what the movement is doing at the level of the consciousness, at the level of the minds of the people, and the institutional change and the policies that derive from the institutional change, the gap is huge. There are some symptoms. The Pirate Party in Europe, which at this point has 10% of the national vote in Germany and 12% in Sweden, and is now being created in France and Spain, with only one point in the program: real democracy through the internet. Again, another utopian version, but there are all kinds of initiatives are filtered down. Now, if I'm not an expert, but I studied some of the history, in the last lap of the 19th century in Europe, the traditional dichotomy between conservative and liberal parties became emptied in relationship to the new forms of social protests and social movements in society, mainly represented by the working class movement, the origins of the working class movement, but also by others. At that point, the conservatives remain the influential political force in society, because the conservatives have always a very simple program: to conserve the power relationships. And they mute themselves, but the ultimate program is that. But the parties of reform, of social reform, like the liberal parties in different countries, were destroyed by this social revolution, because people did not have a political expression. It took them a relatively long time, but not many, not 1 century, 2 or 3 decades, depending on countries, until a new left within the political system started to appear to express the interests of the disaffected and disenfranchised masses in society. It's not a prediction. I simply find difficult to believe that all these consciousness transformation could take place again and again over the next years without some kind of expression into the political system. It's simply a hypothesis that I point out. And then my last conclusion relating to all the debate that had been generated about social movement, that Mario introduced very well, broader than the internet-based social movements. Ultimately, what makes the difference in terms of the existence or not existence of social movement is not so much the permanence of the social movement. It's not so much that they succeed in traditional terms. They all die. Social movements are flowers destined to die, co-opted, repressed, integrated, transformed in civil wars, transformed in political machines. But which are their effects at the moment of their death? how productive their death is the critical point. And what is relatively important in this movement, that because their lasting effect is on people's mind through freeing the communication space, their lasting effects will be more in the way people think and feel than in the way people vote. Thank you.
Well, let's just talk directly to Manuel. You can direct the...
Oh, no, you do it. Hey, I cannot do everything.
Can I start?
Sure.
The talk is not a criticism. I had a very convincing talk, a very convincing analysis. However, I like to speculate a little bit on possible developments of this, or some of the processes you highlighted, and I got a couple in mind. First, the issue, there is an aside and there is a big issue. The aside is the issue of violence on violence is crucial. I, broadly speaking, agree with you. However, there is another possible way of looking at it, namely the fact that very often in movements, also important is the potential, the capacity of threat.
The capacity of?
Threat. Namely, the capacity to inflict or to suggest they might inflict damage. And somehow the relation is difficult. For example, in the fear, I think the fear of the Soviet Union in Europe has been an important factor in supporting the capacity of the socialist parties in the West. If you think of Italy, when the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't make the Italian moderates any more sympathetic towards an extremely moderate left by any standard. But if anything, the end of this combined threat, internal and external threat, could be seen as something actually pushing them, encouraging them to go further in their claims and in their demands from a right-wing perspective, moving them to the right rather than vice versa. So it's more complicated than that. But just to hint this fact, very often in movements, for example, if you think of anti-road protests in Britain, there is actually a division of labor between the radical one, not they were strictly speaking violent, but we had the very radical ones and the more moderates in terms of balancing off the different strategies. But the big issue is, as you said, the issue of the movement is not necessarily creating a new alternative. This is the classic idea of the movement going for power in the kind of Bolshevik line of thinking. But
or the social democratic movement.
Oh yeah, or the social democratic for sure. The question is, however, as you said, there is a lack. The problem is the presence or absence of interlocutors or conversationists or references in the system, and which is clearly lacking. You pointed that out very clearly. Is clearly lacking these days. Now the issue is to what extent the emphasis that they are placing on the rejection of the system as a whole. In the absence, in the absence of mid-term results, could not simply contribute to the spread to the reinforcement of an anti-politics kind of sentiment that might ultimately play out in the hands of populist right-wing parties. Because this is something which has been out of your presentation. Because the possibility of economic crisis turning bad and leading into totally different types of mechanisms. Anti-politics has been particularly dominant among the right wing in Europe. It's not distinctive of the left. And I would like to listen a little bit of your elaboration on that.
Well, absolutely. I left this out simply because I was trying mainly to describe for you this animal that we are talking about, not to do a whole analysis, but I place this in the context of this broader analysis. But I tried to say, well, these are the eyes, the nose, these are the legs. But you're absolutely right. First, in terms of the threats, again, people react to fear primarily. And the political systems and the population. That's why violence is extremely important, because it instills fear. And so what is the fear in each country varies at this point. Quickly and then concentrate on Europe. In the Arab revolutions, the fear is, for one part of the population, is Islamism. Supported by the United States and the Western powers, for whom this is intolerable, and they're trying to see if it is like Turkey or not like Turkey. So there is a scapegoat. There is Islamism. In the United States, it's more complicated, but the right-wing movement that has developed was the Tea Party. The big failure of the Tea Party is that it was immediately co-opted by the Republican Party, and therefore stopped being a populist right-wing social movement. I call them the stormtroopers of the Republican Party nowadays. And that's actually, this has eliminated a lot of resistance against the government. Now, okay, you are Tea Party, you are Republican Party, and some occupiers of the Occupy movement come from the Tea Party, which is an interesting. So it's an anti-system, anti-establishment movement that has been now politicized in the sense that cannot be legitimate in the revolt. In Europe, you are absolutely right. People say, well, other countries don't have this movement. Yes, it's a different form of movement, but it's an anti-establishment movement which goes into right-wing, populist, xenophobic trend, which is very deep, you know, much better than me, and in some countries it's essential. It's essential in Scandinavia, it's essential in France, it's essential in Italy. In all the countries it's hovering around 20% of the vote. So I would have a hypothesis. Countries where you have movements that with other values express the disaffection with the system have much lower xenophobic right-wing movement. Greece, Portugal, Spain, France has no movement, but France has Le Pen. Norway has no movement, but Norway has a killer party. I mean, the guy who killed is from one party, which is currently the second largest party with 21%. Finland, the true Finns. So all these countries don't have a movement of the Occupy style. So sometimes in some of my discussion with European political leaders say, well, what you have to choose. You want Occupy or you want fascist? Because the disaffection of the system goes both ways. So I totally agree with you, and I did not include this simply because I was talking about the Occupy, but you're absolutely right. The crisis of legitimacy has two political expressions. None of these political expressions can be truly within the political party system because they delegitimize that. So the people who are creating parties are people on the right, not on the left. Oh, the Netherlands. The Netherlands, the Wilders is coming to the United States next week to present his book on titled How I Am Surviving the Invasion of Islam and the Destruction of Europe. And he's the leader of the largest party in the Netherlands now that just forced the government to collapse because the government was not right-wing enough. And the other thing that you mentioned, the presence or absence of interlocutors. That's the critical thing. And in our analysis with Karim, we try to identify this as a key variable. Depending on how the gatekeepers decide to open or not to open the gates, there will be a different dynamics. What I call the title of my conclusion, the book is Social Movements and Reform Politics, an Impossible Love. So my notion is that it's not impossible if they are the two partners, but if one partner doesn't do anything with the other, then it's impossible. But there is a big distrust. But the variable that we have there, Mario, is under which condition there is interlocution or not. And for the time being, I don't see it anywhere in Europe. Sasha.
So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more, in more depth about the dynamics inside the Occupy movement. And I'm not sure, it played out very differently across the different movement spaces that you're describing, the local contexts. But in Occupy, in terms of race and gender dynamics in Occupy, I'm totally convinced by your entire sort of presentation of what you found with the movements, but not by the footnote to which in the presentation you just did, you sort of described almost as marginal the internal conversations about to what degree really taking race and gender seriously within Occupy is going to be crucial to whether the movement can spread beyond the predominantly white college students. Although it's a very diverse movement and it depends on which local occupier you're looking at, the reality is if we look at the demographic data, it hasn't spread to the quote-unquote 99%, it's the 25 or so percent. And so in some occupies, there have been real serious conversations, not just about how do we increase the diversity of representation in a kind of tokenism. We need more people of color at the General Assembly, but how do we actually understand deeply the political dynamics in the United States and the way that wealth inequality has always been linked to the ability of the ruling class to link workers along lines of race, class, gender, and sexuality as they intersect, as they're experienced and lived by different people occupying different positions in the United States political system, and how that historically has been the reason why we haven't had the emergence of a strong alternative to the two-party system where both parties represent the interests of the financial class. Some of the occupiers are really having that conversation, taking it seriously, and trying to get beyond just a representational politics of identity to a structural analysis that's intersectional. And so I'd love to just hear you talk more about that and how that's contextual by country. But what can Occupy in the U.S. learn from some of the other movements, and conversely, how does the unique historical composition of the United States and its population make it in some ways a more difficult space than perhaps some of the other cases?
You're absolutely right. It's it's a fundamental point. I have not. I didn't say that was marginal. I say simply that people don't define themselves as I am gender, I am this, I am that. But in fact, taking seriously what I'm proposing, which is people go into the movement for their own motivation and attitude, that would reinforce the need to see what happens in terms of the people who primarily feel that they are excluded and humiliated, etc., for reasons of race and gender. Now, the point is that empirically speaking, I have seen the debate in the movement, but I have not seen this as a main theme of the movement. So that, and what I have been trying to stick very closely to what these movements are, because it's such a confusion that I want that we have, at least in the first phase of the movement, a profile of what they really are. Now, what I have seen, and please, John and Lana, correct me in this, and Kevin, what I have seen is tensions within the movement in the United States. Say in a minute about your tensions in the movement. And some of the arguments have been, well, you do not represent people of color, you do not represent the specific interests of women. And the debate that I have seen, the response is, well, we don't represent anyone. People have to represent themselves, so come here and do things. That has been my perception. So it's not that you need a platform for women, a platform for this, a platform for that. No, you are all here, and everybody does his, her own movement. That's what I think. It's not like having a platform for a traditional organization.
Right. Let me rephrase it then. So the response to that argument, right, is that the classical response of the white left to people of color has been, our space is open, you should come participate, and then we can build a movement that everyone is part of. The problem is that when people are existing in positions of structural inequality that give some people more free time, where some people have access to increased levels of digital tools and skills and literacies, where basically access to all kinds of resources is structured not only it is structured by race and gender in addition to your position within occupation. And so the issue then becomes a space that's supposedly open reproduces the structural inequalities of race and gender. So how do we, how does a movement...
That's the normative way. Okay,
So,
okay.
So talk about that dynamic a little bit. How does a movement move beyond the space of saying, we're open, everyone can participate, come to the table? And it's the Fraser's critique against Habermas, right? I mean, this debate goes on endlessly.
Well, that normative, and you know, I rarely venture into the normative thing in an academic meeting, because, first, there had been moments in the movement in Occupy, and which these some key demands concerning racial inequality, the mobilization against the guy who was executed, right? You say the name.
Well, both Troy Davis and Trayvon Martin, Occupy played an interesting role in spreading some of the mobilization. So they're certainly links.
So that was one of the things. So it's kind of a Robin Hood coalition to some extent. Given that there is a movement and that exists and is Occupy, etc., anything that happens in society that is outrageous against women or against people of color, almost automatically will be repercuted and taken sympathetically by the movement. I don't see the movement saying, no, this is not in our platform. But I want John to say.
Well, yeah, the Trayvon Martin Million Hoodies marches never would have happened without Occupy, right? And so I think what we're trying to do, I mean in LA anyway, is we're trying to follow. We follow the lead of people of color who say, well, you come to our spaces and you participate in our general assemblies on Skid Row. There's the Occupy the Hood Action Assembly, which is a general assembly that moves around the city. And while Occupy LA, I do not believe is predominantly white at this point, but was at one point, it's more than an issue of color. It's an issue of poverty, right? And so we all can kind of get behind this point that we're somewhat poor, and that we need to mobilize around that. But within the people of color community, I think that in Occupy, we actually had to, well, we're learning how to understand reform in a different way, because the black community valorizes to some degree reform. Even members that I know that were part of or continue to be part of the Black Panther Party still respect the efforts of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, even though that they had been sort of pitted against each other in one way or another. So in Occupy, I think the move, when you're dealing with sort of the structural problems that are present in our outside society, race, class, gender, you try to take a step back, have that deliberation, have that debate, listen, refrain from name calling, which doesn't always work. And then, because there are so many ways to mobilize ideas, to turn ideas into action, if someone has a good idea that tries to mitigate these tensions, we try to amplify that idea and walk with it. But it's a very difficult thing, and it's the problem of trying to build the new society in the shell of the old. It's that the shell of the old is incredibly suffocating, and it's impossible to crack in a way.
Bruce.
Yeah.
No, Bruce first.
Well, I want to say I really liked the talk, and I just put a reminder in my calendar to look in mid-September to look for the book and buy it.
Thanks.
I want to put together a couple of points that you made and then ask you basically what comes next. So, not in your research.
Normative and future. The two things.
Yes, exactly. Right. So you end with the notion that movements change minds, and that's the kind of lasting legacy. And you ask us to think about movements as networks in which are tightly integrated with the technology. And you make this lovely point that the technology materializes autonomy or embodies technology. So if these movements are successful, presumably one of the ways that minds are changed has to do with autonomy. So that makes me think, what kind of institutional arrangements and regimes do you see in the future in which autonomy is more manifest than it is now? But I also want to ask you to talk more about the sort of crisis of legitimacy that democratic regimes are in. You suggest that democracies have kind of run out of gas, and I wonder in what sense, why must it be a crisis of legitimacy in the sense that it's unstable? Why might we not be in an equilibrium of mistrust that's just going to persist? And is it not sort of hopeful or progressive to expect the legitimacy to rise or reach a crisis and then be resolved in the next phase or wave? I hope you have a good answer.
Well, but you see, I have to give an honest answer.
Yes.
I cannot just invent or fake the answer. The answer is I don't know. But no, thinking aloud on this thing. The two matters are related. We are exactly in the situation that you described, an equilibrium of mistrust. You want the data, I can send you the latest wave of data on all these matters. People don't trust each other, don't trust the political institutions, don't trust the government, don't trust the banks, don't trust the parliament, don't trust anything. And at least in the United States they trust God, but not in Europe. So it's, and by the way, that's why evangelicals are taken over everywhere, because they are filling a void. So there is cynicism in political terms, there is widespread cynicism, don't trust anybody, and it's very clear that people everywhere say, no, it's not that I don't trust the government, or I don't trust this party, I don't trust any party. For instance, in Spain, in the election in Spain, of course, with such a destruction of the vote of the Socialist Party, some people would expect that the left-wing party would get something. Oh yeah, they doubled, no, they tripled their seats in the parliament, going from 2 to 11 in a parliament of 350. You see the point? It's because yes, there is some marginal support for them, but no more. So, first thing, there is very little hope within the current political institutions to remedy this crisis of trust. First thing. So there are two ways in which things are ramping up. One, by bits and pieces, there's some movement in the political system. Some. Not in Spain. But in Spain, only in the Basque Country. In the Basque Country, the pro-independence, ex-terrorist party is now #1 political force in terms of the election. But the rest of Spain, nothing. In Germany, I just was collecting the data for an article. At this point, the current situation in Germany is the Pirate Party has 10% of the vote, the Greens 14%, the left-wing party, which is the ex-Communist Party of East Germany, 7%, and Merkel 35%. So all these things. All these parties together have more than Merkel, okay? And the Social Democrats 27%. So the only possibility for Germany in a year from now, if this continues to be the case, will be the Grosse Coalition. And yeah, sure, we all get together, so the vote doesn't get robbed. So right and left and center all together against the barbarians at the gates. How long this can be sustained? That's the issue. That is the issue. And that is where I go into all things being equal. If nothing happens, if we're still being able to consume, to have a joyful, more or less joyful life, if enough xenophobic feelings to beat up the other rather than change ourselves, etc. Yes, but if there is a crisis at the heart of the system, which is being meaning the welfare state, which is what in Europe was what sustained social stability. If the welfare state is under not threat, under process of partial dismantlement as it is, then there is no social cohesion in economic terms and no political trust. So yes, ultimately, through police. I mean, and then we go into the consolidated states that Steve was talking about. You can still, you have the monopoly, the legitimate monopoly of violence, you can maintain the system, but if we look historically, and you have been doing this all the time, this complete crisis of legitimacy in contradiction with the principles of representation and with the notion of citizens that they can actually intervene in their government has limits. So the only thing I can say at this point is that I see the poles of the contradiction. And I see the accentuation of the crisis because of the accentuation of the economic crisis. And the one thing that could hold all these societies is, Mario said, threat, external threat. Chinese people taking power, taking over the world, immigrants coming into the sacred land of Christianity, and then all this fury deviated against the external threat. That's a possibility. But that's also deepening the crisis of legitimacy and changing the conditions of democracy. So what I don't see is the structural, economic, institutional, and psychological conditions to go on indefinitely with the current combined crisis. That you want my comment that 1 second. Thank you.
Okay, one key comment on the previous discussion, and I have one question. The mistrust cannot be the equilibrium. By definition, mistrust is the state of maximal uncertainty. We don't know whoever do what. So, but equilibrium is, by definition, it's the minimal or zero uncertainty. So these two cannot be the same. That's my one comment. And question is, I'm really interested in you introduced the two psychological or emotional factors, the hope and fear. I really like that. But my understanding about the hope is like there are some possibility, but still I'm not 100% for sure. There are also uncertainty. So I would like to interpret the hope or fear as a kind of a risk-taking or a risk perception. So if you see some possibility, but if you are not 100% for sure you will get the positive outcome or not, then it's a social movement with hope can be reinterpreted as a risk-seeking behavior or risk-seeking tendency, which is well theorized by Tversky and Kahneman in their prospect theory. And surprising thing is, animals also shows risk-seeking behavior, especially the environment is very severe or a bad condition. But my question is, I don't know if the animals do communicate with each other in any meaningful way, but I'm pretty sure they don't have a Twitter or Facebook or something. If so, what's the communication technology does matter in social movement with hope? Because we can easily find the animal behavior they don't have.
That's a very deep question. Look, I know nothing about cognitive science and neuroscience or any of that stuff about emotion. I just read and then I try to connect things because I think the emotional component of these movements is very important. It's extremely important. And when I'm in trouble, I show what I do to my friend Damasio, and he tells me if it is completely stupid or not, and if it is completely, I don't even talk about it, but he said, well, you could think something like this. Not serious, not scientific, but at least you could talk about it. In terms of the theory of affective intelligence, which there are a number of serious people who really know about that, the risk avoidance and risk taking is a fundamental part, and has been experimentally shown the direct connection between fear and risk avoidance, and outrage and risk taking. That's experimental findings. So my point in addressing what you are saying is that equilibrium appears to result from the lack of expectations of improvement because of the risk inherent to try to do something else, confronting all the mechanisms of control. Remember, anyone occupying illegally knows that the police is going to come. Okay? That's risk. Okay? So you don't do that if your mechanism of risk avoidance, which is linked to fear, prevails. You only do that if you are so fed up, so outraged, that then risk-taking behavior picks up. That's directly, this is wired in the brain, apparently. I don't know, but they say this is wired in the brain. And therefore, and once you are in the action, then the two mechanisms that support the positive emotion and becomes a collective action is, on the one hand, that you do it with many others. And it's a constant verification process. Oh yeah, they're going to club me, but we are too many. Maybe they club the other, not me, and then I will be in solidarity with the other. So the notion of being together becomes a protector. And then at one point, when enough people do enough things for enough long time, then hope picks up. And then things start, then you overcome completely the mechanism of risk avoidance, because you hope that ultimately you will make some difference, that therefore you are not going to be all the time under police threat. So that's more or less the mechanism that I have been. And so equilibrium depends on how people manage one thing with the other. But to that theory I add something else, which is the spread of the emotions and the spread of the hope. Because, so if equilibrium is broken in one particular thing, this explains me why the humiliation in Tunisia, etc., happened. But what is very interesting for me for these movements is why what happened in Tunisia matters in Egypt. Why what happens in Spain matters in the United States, and Ed Buster called to occupy the United States on the basis of the experience in Spain. So that, and this is not like reorganizing the Anarchist International or the Communist International, because that was bureaucracy. It's about connecting minds and emotions throughout the globe. And when a group of people that I knew personally in September 2011 in Barcelona, from the United States, a number of European countries, decided like this to call for a global day of action on October 15th, and simply with a slogan as sophisticated and precise as United for Global Change. United for Global Change, come. Someone tried. People say no, org. And then on October 15th, there are 951 cities in 82 countries and several million people demonstrating with no previous organization, just calling the internet. That mechanism is what is important for me to understand. And for me, that mechanism is the connection of the hope generated by some other people are doing it, and I am fed up what happens in my city, and therefore I'm going to join that movement. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really dizzying talk. I'm going to think about it for a while. And I'd like to go back to Bruce's point about the equilibrium of despair, or whatever he called it. And this point about does communication matter, maybe some of Sasha's points about we need to look at multi-layers of communication. And here's my question to you.
He probably need to talk about the media ecology, and he didn't do it, but we'll see that, Sasha.
So I agree with the similarities you point out across these different movements, to a point. But I don't agree that the public supports Occupy in the U.S. In fact, the polls suggest that today it's 16% support for Occupy. So, but I do agree with what you said about the public.
It was 25 a month ago.
Yeah, I know. So it's falling like a rock. So, and that's interesting. It never peaked 50, but since the evictions, it's been under 40 and falling. But I think that's interesting. I mean, the interesting thing is that you're correct that the U.S. public has supported positions taken by Occupy, but they supported those positions long before Occupy ever came into existence. So I can show you 10 to 15 years of super majorities in the American public who believe the rich have been paying too little taxes, who believe the corporations have been paying too little taxes, who believed that corporations have too much power. I mean, 70% of Americans have believed for a decade or more, or 15 years, that corporations have too much power, that we have too little power. And so these super majorities existed. Occupy came along. I think Occupy's effect was twofold, but it hasn't won the hearts and minds of the American public as a movement that they want to embrace. And I think it matters whether a movement wins the hearts and minds of the public. I think it did in Iceland. I think it did in Egypt. I think it did in Spain. I think it did not in America. But I don't think that means Occupy had no effect in America. So I think the interesting question is that if you can see some important differences across these movements, we should point them out and figure out what they are doing politically in their respective political context. And so given that setup, what I'm going to sort of ask you is, does it matter that only 16% of Americans support Occupy? Maybe that doesn't matter, and I'm sort of agnostic about the answer to that question. Does it matter that a majority of Spaniards do support the Indignados? And then what if what Occupy's contribution has been is twofold? One is the old social movement tactics of direct political pressure on the Democratic Party and on Barack Obama personally to actually deliver his promise of hope and change. To the point where he polled the abstract issues surrounding that and discovered they polled reasonably well with his needed voter demographics. And so he lifted them away from Occupy without ever claiming Occupy as a support group for those ideas, nicely distancing himself rhetorically from that, and taking some of those positions which he, lo and behold, discovered Americans have long supported anyway. And so there's one direct political tactic that I think Occupy succeeded with, but the other one is equally interesting, which is that out of the crowd bubbled up the 99%, which we've talked about. And it has gone viral, but not among Occupy supporters at large, but among the public. I mean, that has become a meme that a lot of people can identify with, and that Barack Obama is now using. So we see these memes that have taken on lives of their own without necessarily being connected cognitively or affectively by publics back to supporting Occupy. So I guess my question is, does it really, would we want Occupy to communicate differently so that the publics might embrace it more, or is it doing just fine in the US and it's doing just fine in Spain because public support it even more?
First, what you mentioned now is the thing that preoccupies me most, and I would say probably the preoccupy more people in the movement, absolutely. First of all, it does matter if the 16%, it will not translate into anything direct, but it does matter. It really does matter if you have support or not. Although for me, the most relevant figure is not the level of support, but the relationship between support and opposition. That's the critical thing. And a month ago, there were 27% for, 25% against. Again, because we should not forget that this is, after the evictions, it's an illegal movement that is under direct threat, etc. So my point is that still is a significant size of the population that is more supportive than critical. And the others, look, in a situation like France, 3/4 of the people would, at this point, would oppose any occupation. It's not the case in the United States, because all the others are indifferent, or not know. For me, the data about I don't know is relevant. So the two things, the relationship and the data about not know. So it is relevant. But you are right that most of the issues that were raised were in the public opinion polls way before the Occupy, although I would say they have been accentuated somewhat, particularly in relationship to the notion of inequality. One of the things that we discovered with Lana is something very interesting, which was not before. There we have the point in time. People in America now, in the majority, think that there are class conflict, that there is a conflict between the rich and the poor. This did not exist before. So the notion of class and the notion that there is conflict between the rich and the poor was not there. So some of the elements have shifted.
Right.
However, the two important thing for me is, on the one hand, you precisely because there was this general crisis of legitimacy and this feeling, precisely the Occupy movement could pick up. So, pre-existing conditions were then expressed in the movement. And the key question becomes, is going to be a dialectical relationship, pre-existing crisis of legitimacy, help the movement to emerge, and then by its emergence, the movement deepen the crisis of legitimacy or not. So, and there we need different indicators. Some of the indicators go into the direction have not. Some others, like this one, and I can find others in the direction that maybe yes. But then from there comes the issue of what is the relationship to the institutional system with the possibility of ultimately reform politics. Most of the reform politics happens not by meeting with the movement and saying, okay guys, let's talk. That's only wonderful desire, but other than that in other countries it doesn't happen this way. It's about Obama thinking, these guys are theoretically my guys, they cannot be too upset, I'm going to do something. Instead of doing 100%, I'm going to do 20%. And this 20% is the incremental contribution to reform. Yeah. But Peter doesn't want me to pick up.
Thank you, Manuel, for Well, we've come to the end of our conference here. We want to thank you, Janet and Nash and Manuel and I, for accepting our invitations and coming and spending the last couple of days with us. It's been great for us. We love these kinds of conferences because they're so interesting and so stimulating and so much opportunity to share ideas, both ours and yours, together. And we've really enjoyed it and hope you have too. If you have any questions in terms of ways to get home or any need for taxis or anything like that, be sure to ask Amanda, and be sure to get your receipts to her so that she can reimburse you. And in closing, I want to say thank you to two people who were particularly helpful. One was Susie, who and the other is Amanda, who has been Safe journeys.
Thank you.